Well, hello there, boys and girls, and welcome back to Mighty Ride Junkies. You have made it to the fourth video of the history of Universal Studios' Halloween Horror Nights at the Hollywood location. There's only one more video before this entire series is wrapped up and I can move on from it, at least for now. So let's just get right into where I left off. So, with the hit and miss of the 2015 season, 2016 brought in some sluggers. Starting with the least powerful, Eli Roth's Terror Tram, which brought a really solid story with a lame duck, overused maze. Once again, the pathway was the same, but the story was pretty interesting, all things considered. Hollywood Harry, a clown who worked for Universal Studios Hollywood, was basically fired for slowly going crazy and becoming violent, and eventually he snaps when he's terminated from the property. He then stalks the backlot of Universal looking for his next victim.
If you know the whereabouts of this clown, do not approach him. He is extremely dangerous.
Using the tagline, Beyond Your Wildest Screams, 2016 brought back fan favorite Leatherface in The Texas Chainsaw Massacre Blood Brothers, which honestly was just a rehash of some previous maze highlights from previous years, as well as new additions from the newest titles in the franchise. The network FX reached a deal with Universal to bring Ryan Murphy's American Horror Stories to Halloween Horror Nights. The 2016 maze featured some key highlights from the Murder House, Freak Show, and Hotel Seasons. Being a huge fan of the show, I can honestly say this maze really didn't bring anything in scare factor. It was more of a ooh and ah, looking at the set pieces and scene reenactments from the show. On to a maze that people either loved or hated, Krampus. Now, while I'm not here to do a movie review, I must admit, this movie was given a bad reputation for the wrong reasons. This film is definitely categorized as a dark comedy, very similar to cult classics like Army of Darkness. Just look at the cast. Almost all are known for comedic roles and stand-up. Krampus is also a little near and dear to me due to me being told the story of Krampus when I was a child to try and get me to be a good little boy. The maze did everything it could to try and capture what the movie did all the way to the grand finale scene. While I know a lot of people weren't a fan of the movie or the maze, this is definitely a maze to me that's high up on my list of favorites. Freddy Krueger and Jason Voorhees made another appearance together in the maze Freddy vs. Jason, which I still feel like this was just a maze to either just fill a spot on the roster or try and get the public's interest again in these horror icons. I mean, the maze was based on a film that came out almost 15 years prior. And now, while Halloween Horror Nights has used older movies from the past, this particular movie has had sequels and remakes come out after it. As well, the Freddy vs. Jason film wasn't very well received when it was released in theaters. While it did spawn probably one of my favorite comic book crossovers, bringing this particular film to life seemed unneeded. Little did I know, it was simply a teaser for next year's theme, but more on that later. Michael Myers also returned for Halloween Hell Comes to Haddonfield. The maze began right where the last one ended from last year and took maze goers through the second installment of John Carpenter's masterpiece. The maze was okay. It wasn't exactly a letdown, but when you compare it to last year's maze, it was definitely underwhelming. But the maze that took this year was The Exorcist. While the maze did have the usual reenactments of popular scenes from the film, the amount of hidden trap doors in it actually managed to get me a couple times. The design of this maze was completely developed to make sure you didn't have any breathing room to catch your breath from the last scare, including a grand finale that was pretty popular in the 2017 season, essentially where there are multiple trap doors near the exit of the maze, meaning you jumping away from the monster coming out of the trap door just puts you in the path of another trap door that a monster was waiting to come out and get you, and so on and so forth. This also marked the first year that the permanent Walking Dead attraction was considered in the rotation at Halloween Horror Nights. Jabberwocky also returned this season and was more exciting than that year-round Walking Dead maze. 2016 also saw a pretty interesting scare zone introduced for the Purge election year. Most scare zones at any Halloween park, you pass through it and scare actors assigned to the area attempt to scare you. This time around, the scare zone was funneled and sealed off from alternative routes. While you were out in the open and didn't have closed walls guiding you through the scare zone, one could argue that it was technically a maze because you only had one way in and one way out, and you couldn't go back the way you had just came. I actually really love this, especially when using it for something like The Purge. The concept returned the following year with an original design called Urban Inferno that gave a more modernized look for Dante's Inferno. And in 2018, this scare zone / maze saw it rethemed into Holidays in Hell, which was a brief show of every holiday with a Halloween twist. Now we come to 2017, which featured a powerhouse of mazes. Let's start with the obvious, the Terror Tram. Titans of Terror was hinted at last year's Halloween Horror Nights with merchandise bearing the words with pictures of your favorite horror icons, and it eventually led to 2 attractions in the 2017 Horror Nights. The first being the Titans of Terror Tram, hosted by everyone's favorite good guy doll, Chucky. And this had to be one of the weakest entries I've ever seen for the Terror Tram. While we've always had the same layout, the story behind the Terror Tram is what made at least me want to go back on it every year. This year, the story was epically lame. Chucky has learned to send his spirit, Charles Lee Ray, into multiple people at a time without touching them, like it was required in previous films. So, without explaining how all of a sudden this is possible, you just have to accept it. And that's it. That's the story. You then find yourself going through an overused maze with many scare actors dressed as Chucky, a barely present Jason Voorhees bit, before a heavily present Leatherface. Looking back at it now, I think the reason why Leatherface was more present and had more bits inside this maze may have something to do with the death of Texas Chainsaw creator Tobe Hooper, passing less than a month before opening night. Freddy Krueger also made appearances with many different costumes to go with the surrounding area that honestly didn't make a lot of sense. Originally I thought I was outrunning Chucky, but am I to understand now I'm in a nightmare now? I mean, the year's slogan was "The best nightmares never end," but this could have been slightly better done. But then, as you ride back, you see what the maze was for all along. Advertisement for the Cult of Chucky, the newest installment in the Child's Play franchise at the time. Now, I'm a fan of the Child's Play films, but I really feel like this is a little disrespectful to the character. You have a maze you are just clearly using for advertisement, but you fear that may not be enough to draw crowds, so you throw in big heavyweight names like Leatherface, Krueger, and Voorhees to try to attract more people. On to the return of American Horror Stories, which, unlike last year's, only concentrated on one season, Roanoke. The maze was entertaining, but the layout was a huge letdown. For instance, the entrance blocks used to tell you what season you were about to go into during last year's event was now back with pointless messages on them that didn't fit with the rest of the maze. I mean, they even kept up the curtains that were used for Freak Show. It was very clear that all they did was gut the inside of this area and put in new props. The next 2 mazes were kind of a tie for me, and that's probably because I'm being a little biased. I have been a massive fan of the Insidious films and the mazes since their development, but this year's Insidious Beyond the Further didn't meet the same bar that was set from the previous 2 mazes of earlier years. The beginning of this maze was extremely confusing. One thing I loved about Halloween Horror Nights mazes is you could always tell what movie you were in if multiple movies took up that maze. For instance, the previous Insidious maze, you knew when you were in a part from the first film or the second film. Not so much this year. I kept telling myself, okay, am I in the third film or the first? It wasn't until I was in the lipstick-faced demon's little apartment in The Further did I realize I was in the first film. But being a massive Insidious fan, I feel like I'm not being critical enough, which leads me to believe the next maze was superior. The Horrors of Blumhouse focused on 3 franchises from Blumhouse Productions: The Purge, Sinister, and Happy Death Day. The Purge is always a win for me, and I wanted to steal this American flag so badly. That is pure America right there. But something I've been waiting for a while for Universal to do was a Sinister maze. While it had to share with 2 other franchises, I was finally happy to see this come to life in a maze form. Now, Happy Death Day, I must admit, I really didn't have any interest in seeing. The trailers really didn't catch my interest, and the movie just looked meh. But the segments from the maze did in fact pique my interest enough to actually want to see the movie, so job well done on that advertisement. Now on to a maze I'm either going to get a lot of hate or support for my opinions. Ash vs. the Evil Dead, based on the show from the Starz Network. This maze I was the most excited for. I have been a huge Deadite fan since, well, I can remember. I've always thought so highly of Sam Raimi and Bruce Campbell after watching the Evil Dead trilogy, and while my favorite is the second Evil Dead, how could anyone hate the sheer creepiness of the first film, or the cult classic that is Army of Darkness? When I heard Bruce Campbell was returning as Ash Williams, I checked for updates on the show like a meth addict. Time and time again, the people behind Halloween Horror Nights have expressed interest in making an Evil Dead maze, but had the issue of finding enough scare actors that look like Bruce Campbell, or more so people with massive chins. Not Scary Farm had gotten around this when they turned their log flume ride into an Evil Dead themed ride years before. All they did was cut out Ash Williams and focus on the Deadites. And when Universal had the ability to make a maze based on the remake, they wasted no time in doing so. So an Evil Dead maze with Ash Williams was long overdue. But finally, the hit TV show and demand of the public made the studio finally pull the trigger by making the cheapest masks of Bruce Campbell you will ever see. Now, remember that long-necked Deadite from the second film and an episode from the show? While it does make an appearance in this maze, holding its long neck up is nothing more than just a normal piece of rope. Seriously, they couldn't spend a little bit more time on the animatronics here? I mean, all the time and effort put in these mazes, no one could brainstorm a better way to move and hold that long neck up? Pushing those 2 things aside, you have one hell of a maze that any good Evil Dead fan will enjoy. My only concern about this maze is that it may not return for some time. Apart from the show being cancelled, I couldn't tell you how many people I heard in line say they had either never heard of the show or never seen it. Boy, did I suppress my nerd rage that day. On to perhaps what was the boldest move Murdy has done in bringing Stanley Kubrick's The Shining to life. The Shining has an amazing amount of key iconic moments wrapped into one film, from the famous "Here's Johnny" door scene to seeing 2 girls down a hallway staring into your soul. Murdy brought perfection to these moments into the maze, with the exception of the elevator scene, which was basically a clip of the scene projecting on a giant screen with props on the ground. However, pushing that tiny bit aside, this maze was bold and brave to do. The amount of key scenes that had to somehow be brought to life had to give the creative team massive headaches. Yet, Murdy somehow figured out a way. So I clapped my hands together. Well done, sir. Well done. Saw, the Games of Jigsaw. This is easily the best Saw maze to take place at Halloween Horror Nights. You got a front row seat and sometimes up close and personal to some of the traps from the Saw movies. Starting with the knife face trap seen in Saw 7, to of course the famous Amanda and the reverse bear trap, and of course half a dozen others spanning from the entire Saw franchise. What made the icing on the cake is in each room the video of Billy the Puppet was playing, explaining to each person why they were in the situation, just like in the films. It almost felt like you were one of Jigsaw's minions, making sure everything was going according to plan. This maze has so much potential for the future, possibly featuring different tests not seen before. Hopefully we will see a sequel or something to the effect in the future. Finally, on to my number 1 maze for the 2017 season, Titans of Terror. This maze was brilliantly done. You already know you're going to get a crowd when you say Kruger, Voorhees, and Leatherface are going to be in one giant maze. But the fact you actually put an effort into the maze to actually give it a solid story that makes sense made it so much better. The maze starts off in a teenager's room. Around the room is scattered memorabilia of the 3 horror icons. The TV is playing and you can hear the Halloween host talking about tonight's triple feature. And laying in bed with his Jason hockey mask on is the teenager of the room. It's very clear he falls asleep and we get a passage into his nightmare as the movies begin to play on the TV screen. Mazegoers then find themselves going through many different iconic parts from the 3 franchises, each separated with a dazed dreamlike effect to signal you the next movie was about to start. If there has ever been a maze that deserves to be back the following year, if there has ever been a maze that could be completely unchanged and still get a massive line, then that would have been this maze. If Jabberwocky can return for a 3rd year in a row, then so could this gem of a maze. We only have 1 year left to cover, ladies and gentlemen, and some other things I really want to cover for Universal Studios Hollywood's Halloween Horror Night. So the 2018 season will be covered in part 5 along with everything else I want to talk about. Be patient, it will probably be a lot shorter than the past 4 videos, so potentially will come out faster than the other videos in this series. So until then, I'll see you then, and be safe.